This unit should be a review of things that you have worked on already. Talks about fractions, decimals, and percents. We know that a fraction is a way of expressing a part of a whole, but we also know that a fraction can talk about something, as you're going to see here in a second, when you're comparing things. Like, for example, 7 out of 10 people can be written 7 out of 10 as a fraction. Let's go through some of these as we go through these types of questions here. If you look at this chart here, which you all hopefully have in front of you, if not, then maybe you can look up. What fraction of the buildings that you see there are between 600 and 900 feet tall? You're right. In order to figure out what fraction they are, you need to figure out how many total buildings there are. And so you can count. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 total buildings. What fraction are between 600 and 900 feet tall?
9 out of 10.
We've 1, 2, 3, 4. Basically, if you look at all of them except for
The top one.
this one are between 600 and 900 because this one is above 900. And so 9 out of 10. How would you say this fraction using words?
9 out of 10.
9 out of 10 or 9/10. And how do I write that as a decimal?
0.9.
0.9. So we see that there's 3 different things you could do. You could write it as a fraction, you could write it in words, you could write it as a decimal, and you could even write it as a percent, as you'll see later on. How do I change fractions into decimals? So, sometimes if the denominator is easy to change into 10, 100, or 1,000, you can just do that. For example, if I said change 2/5 into a decimal, you could say to yourself, oh, if I had him as a denominator of 10, in other words, multiplied by 2 and whatever you do to the bottom, you do to the top, and you get 4/10, that's easy, and you can just say, oh, 4/10 is 0.4. However, sometimes your denominator will not be able to be changed into 10 or 100 or 1,000 because you can't multiply anything by it. And so that goes back into reminding you that a fraction is really numerator over denominator. What symbol is that? Division. A fraction is a division problem. And so therefore, when you are changing fractions into decimals, you are going to perform what operation? Division. Top divided by bottom, top in the house. It's top divided by bottom. It's numerator divided by denominator. For example, if I have 3/4 and I want to change it into a decimal, you would do 3 divided by 4. 3 divided by 4. And then you would do your division, and you would get 0.75.
I know that off the top of my head.
So sometimes, as you will see in a little bit, it is going to be in your best interest to just memorize certain fractions and their decimal equivalents because it's really easy to just remember them instead of doing the long division. Think of 3/4, 3/4.
75.
3/4 is 3/4, and 3/4 is 75 cents, which is written as 0.75. 1/2. would be 0.5. If I look at this decimal, it terminates. It means it comes to an end. It does not go on forever. Quick review. If I had something like 7 over 20, you could look at it and say 7 over 20 is the same as multiply by 5, multiply by 5, 35 hundredths, which is 0.35, 35 hundredths. Or numerator divided by denominator, and it terminates.
You can just cut it in half.
If you have a mixed number that you are asked to change into a decimal, for example, 5 and 3/4, you may already know that 3/4 is really 0.75. So 5 and 3/4 is 5 and 75 hundredths. Memorizing some of these conversions make things a lot easier because you work with them often. Like a quarter is 0.25. A half is half a dollar, which is 0.50. 3/4 is 0.75. If I asked you to write 2 and 3/8 as a decimal, what do you know for sure your answer is going to have without having to do any work so far?
A denominator that isn't divisible by 10.
Well, you know it's not divisible by 10, but when you go to write this as a decimal, what can you write right off the bat? 2. You know it's 2 and 3/8, so you know it's going to be 2 point something. And then the 3/8 is again a division problem. 3 divided by 8. 3/8 is often seen in math problems. So you might want to memorize this one, but when in doubt, write it out. You just do the long division. 3 divided by 8 is 0.375, which is again what we refer to as a terminating decimal because it ends. It doesn't go on forever. So 3/8, if you can memorize that 3/8 is 0.375, that's going to make your life so much easier. If not, it's okay. Just do the long division problem. And so 2 and 3/8 is 2 and 2.375. If I asked you to write 1/3 as a decimal, you would do the long division and you would notice that it goes on forever. This is called a repeating decimal. You would write it with the bar over it. I want to ask you guys a question.
How do you use a calculator?
So, I want you to look at this right now. If I asked you to change these 4 fractions into decimals, you know that you would do the division. Looking at these, do you see anything they all have in common?
Yes.
You look at the denominators of all of these, and I just want you to make this observation before you do your division. And I am going to let you, for these problems, just use a calculator because I want to show you something. But look at this guy here. 3, 9, 9, 99. 3 could be changed into 9, couldn't he?
It would be,
What would 3 become? Yeah. You could make this 6 over 9. We know those are equivalent. So essentially, every denominator that you see has a 9 in it. Now, on your calculator, so if I was to do the first problem, which is 6/9, you would do 6 divided by 9. 6 divided by 9. And you would get 0.6 repeating. So we know that 6/9, which is the same thing as 2/3, is 0.6 repeating. Now when we do 1/9, you do 1 divided by 9, and you get 0.1 repeating.
Oh, they're all going to be 0.1 or point something.
4/9, 4 divided by 9, 0.4 repeating. 22 over 99, 22 divided by 99, 0.22222 repeating. Can you make You notice that if I was to make a claim based on this observation,
They're all repeating.
what's all repeating? How would you state it?
All of the decimals are repeating.
How come? So if you wanted to make a rule so everybody would know and you wouldn't have to do the long division,
They all have numbers.
what would your claim be? Just to give you another one. What if I said 7/9? What would this be equal to?
7.
0.7 repeating. You didn't use a calculator, did you?
Oh, yeah, so.
How about 5/9? What's 5/9 equal to? How about 32 over 99?
39 repeating.
No.
32 repeating.
0.32 repeating. So if I had to, once more, if I had to, now that I have investigated and I have made a claim, how would I write that so that from now on I don't have to do my long division and I just know? What would you say?
Anything that is over 9 is
No.
decimal repeating.
Anything that is on.
You could make a very simple claim that any fraction with denominator of 9 or 99 or 999 or anything that can be changed into one of those, such as 3, will have a repeating decimal and the numerator will repeat. That's going to save you time when you don't have the use of a calculator. If you know that the denominator is 9, or the denominator is something that can be changed into 9, or 99, or 999,
Or 9,999.
then the numerator repeats. Now, the key is remembering that there are certain numbers that can be changed into one of those. 999, 999, and so on. Those numbers would be 3, because 3 times 3 gives you 9. It could be 11, because 11 changes into 99. It could be 33, because 33 gives you 99 if you multiply by 3.
Can't you do 30 to make it? Oh, no, you didn't.
So if your denominator is 3, 11, 9, 33, 99, 999, etc., then you can be certain that it will be a repeating decimal. As we just saw, 7/9 is 0.7 repeating, and you use what we call bar notation to repeat a number so that you know that it goes on forever. If I wanted to change a decimal to a fraction,
That's just 0.4.
you basically think about it as, how would you write it as you read it? If you're trying to change a decimal into a fraction, I like to use the phrase write it as you read it, then reduce it. Even though reducing means changing the value into a smaller number, it should be simplified, but it kind of sounds better. Write it as you would read it. So basically you put it over the correct place value position. The correct place value position. Let's look at this. 0.25. 25, there's 2 digits. 100 has 2 zeros. So 25 hundredths, 0.25 is really 25 hundredths. And you would write it as 25 hundredths and then reduce it or simplify it. The word reduce is not the correct word. It should be simplify. So write it as you would read it, then simplify it. If you're not really good with your place values, like I used to struggle when I was your age, I always would then make I made the prediction that, see how there's 2 place values? 100 has 2 zeros. So this is 25 over 100.
Yeah, but also it's
0.7, what is that as a fraction?
7 over
7 over 10. 0.08.
8 over 100.
But you have to simplify it. What is 8 over 100
4
simplify?
over 50.
2 over 25.
Very good. 2 over 25 is the most simplest.
So, yeah.
The most simplified form. Next one.
100, which is 21 over 50.
Fantastic.
Good job.
Number 4.
4 over 100. 250.
4 over
125.
Nice. 4 over 100, which simplifies to 2 over 50, which is 1 over 25. Number 5.
1 over 100.
And then 7 over
And then 7 over
Are you kidding me?
100.
Great. A percentage is a special fraction. The percent symbol, percent, was created to symbolize the fact that percent means out of 100. Notice the 2 zeros right there? Percent out of 100. So when you're talking about percent, it means per 100. For example, 47% is really 47 per 100. Cent. In the United States, there's 100 cents in a dollar. The word cent in French means 100. Cien means 100. So, in Spanish. So, 100 and cent or cien or anything of the sort means 100.
I.
The way it's pronounced. So when you see percent, it means per 100.
Take Spanish.
When you're changing fractions to percents, remember that a ratio is a comparison of two quantities by division. And fractions are ratios. So 34 per 100 is really 34%. If the denominator is 100, very simply, the percentage is just the numerator. 34 hundredths is the same thing as 34 per 100, which would be the same thing as 34%. When you see the word cent, I want you to immediately translate that in your brain to 100. Percent means per 100. 75% is 75 per 100, which means out of 100. So the word per can also be thought of as out of. You can figure out what the percent you earned on a test or a summative by doing a division. If you know that 90 out of 100 is the same as 90%, then you know you got a 90%.
That's easy because it's for the 100.
Correct. 50.5 out of 100 is 50.5%. 3 out of 20 is not out of 100. So you could either try to change the 20 so that the denominator is 100. As easy as this was, 3 times 5 gave you 15, and 20 times 5 gave you 100, so 15 hundredths is the same as 3 twentieths.
That's a terrible grade.
15%. So when you see something like a fraction where the denominator is easy to change to 100, rewrite the fraction as an equivalent fraction over 100, and then the numerator is the percent. But what happens if the denominator is not easily converted to 100? Let's look at these three. These three I purposely chose to do quickly because every denominator can easily be changed to 100. What can I multiply 17 twentieths?
5.
17 twentieths can be multiplied by 5 over 5, and that gives you 85 over 100, which is 85%. 3/5, what do I multiply by?
5.
No.
20.
20 over 20, and that gives me 60 over 100, which is 60%. How about 2 over 25?
4. Multiply by 4. 8 over 100.
I can multiply by 4 over 4, and I get 8 over 100, which is what percent? 8%.
That's like
An average.
So with these questions, when the denominators are easily switched to over 100, you do that, and then the numerator is easily placed as a percent, because now you have rewritten the fraction as 85%. If I asked you to change 3/7 into a percent, you would say, wow, there's nothing multiplied by 7 that's going to give me 100, so I can't do that trick. But I do know that every fraction is what kind of a problem? Division problem. And when you divide your fractions, which method are you supposed to do?
the top and then the
Top in the house. Top divided by bottom. So when you have a fraction that is not easily changed to per 100, you would do 3 divided by 7. 3's in the house. Bring your decimal point. I always add 2 zeros so that I always have a place value. You do your long division that you learned so long ago. 7 goes into 30. How many times?
4.
4 times 7 is 28. Subtract. Bring down. 2, 14. Subtract. Bring down.
9.
8 times 7 is 56. Subtract, oh my goodness, it seems like it's going on for a long time, doesn't it? 40, 5, 35, subtract, bring down, 7, holy cow, 49, subtract, bring down, the 0, 1, 7, 3, bring down, 4, oh, it starts repeating. You notice that denominators of 7 also have repeating. But there's no pattern to them as quickly as the 9 is.
Well, actually,
This guy is actually going to be 0.4285714, 42857, etc. So to write him as a fraction, to write him as a decimal, you would then have to write him as 0.428571 repeating. And then to write it as a percent, as you will see in a little bit, we're going to talk more about it,
43%.
you move it 2 to the right, which would be 42.8571, or about, if you were to round it. In this case, you can round it,
Why not 1 to the
percent.
Why not 1?
Remember that you can even almost see the 100 in the percentage sign. There's the 1 and the 2 zeros. So think about that. Every time you see the percent symbol, it means out of 100.
100.
Out of 100. So when you're asked to change any percentage into a fraction, just put it over 100. But remember that you have to always simplify. So 24% is really simply written as 24 out of 100, which then simplifies to 12 over 50 or 6 over 25. That's the simplest form. You must have the simplest form, always. Simplified form is the correct form. If you were to tell me 24% is 12/50ths, that would not be correct because it's not in the simplest form.
Would you give us half?
So let's talk about percents to decimals. Think about what you already know. You know that percent means out of 100. You know that
You have 2 places.
every fraction is really a division. So if you have something that you can write out of 100, you are going to divide, just like you would any fraction. So we know percent is the same thing as out of 100. And we know that when you have a fraction, you just basically do numerator divided by denominator, where the denominator happens to be 100. And hopefully you recall from earlier on in the year that when you divide by 100, all you do is move the decimal point to the left. So,
Yeah, 'cause I'm gonna remember that.
35%, when I divide 35 by 100. It's 35 divided by 100. If I were to write it the long way, you would say 100 goes into 350 3 times, 300, 50 left over, bring down the 0. It goes into 500 exactly 5, and notice now you have 0.35. When you divide by base 10, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, and so on, you move the decimal, the number of zeros that there is in the 100 or 1,000, to the left. When you divide by 100, there's 2 decimal points that you move. Think of it that way. The shortcut is there's 2 zeros. When you divide, you make things smaller, and to make things smaller, you're going to move the decimal to the left. If I wanted to change 45, which my decimal point is understood to be at the end, if I wanted to make it smaller, I would move to the left, the decimal point. So when you're changing a percent to a decimal, you move the decimal point 2 to the left.
Do you always?
Always. When changing a percent to a decimal, you always move it 2 to the left. And the reason for that shortcut is because when you divide by 100, as you saw hopefully here, I divided 35 by 100. I carried up my decimal point, and then I did my long division, and I ended up with 0.35. So instead of having to do this long division, just remember, if you know 35% is really the same thing as 35 per 100, and 35 over 100 is really a division problem, then you know you can just move the decimal 2 to the left. On the other hand, if you are changing a decimal into a percent, you're going to do the other way around. So, from percent to decimal, 2 to the left. From decimal to percent,
2 to the right.
2 to the right. You're multiplying by 100, so you move it 2 decimal point 2 to the right. I used to always get very confused with these. Do I go to the left? Do I go to the right? And so I discovered a little shortcut, a very visual shortcut. 45% and 0.72. 45%. If I wanted to change it to a decimal, it currently is a percent because there's a percent symbol right there. I'm going to even spice it up, and I'm going to put 45.1%. So when you first look at it, you might go, what? What do you mean? That's already a decimal. No, it's not. That's a percent. Remember, percent is an idea. If I say I'm going to give you 45% of something, you're going to say, of what? 45% or any percent is not an actual quantity. It's an idea of an amount that you're going to take of it, something. So 45.1% is not a decimal. It's a percent. There's a percent symbol there. To change him into a decimal, if you can't recall the shortcut, think of it this way. I want to get away from a percent. I want to make it a decimal. To get away from the percent, I'm going to go that way, away from it. Aren't I? And so therefore, I'm going to go 2 to the left. Now my decimal point is here. That's 0.451 because the 1 is still there. So once more, there's my decimal, 45.1%. I want to get away from the percent and make it a decimal by itself.
Can't you put a 0
1,
instead of
2. No, because the 1 is a worthwhile number. It's actually a valuable number. When you move it to the left, you get 0.451, which is really 0.451. And similarly, if I wanted to change the decimal to a percent, when I want to go into a percent, you could either go, oh, 72 over 100 is really 72%. Or you could look at it and go, I want to put a percent symbol at the end of the number. To put a percent symbol here, I'm going to move the decimal towards it. That gives me 72%. So percent into a decimal, move it 2 to the left. Decimal into a percent, move it 2 to the right. Easy little concepts. A percent is a special fraction because it's over 100. And so therefore, if you wanted to change the percent to a decimal, you're going to divide by 100, which means you move it 2 to the left. And if you want to change a decimal to a percent, you're going to multiply by 100, which means you move it 2 to the right. So as a quick review, go ahead and pause this and try these out. %, remember from percent to a decimal, you move it 2 to the left, so that would be 0.27. 2%, the percent symbol, the decimal is right there to the right of the 2, 2 to the left, fill in that basket, and that's 0.02. Decimal point is right here, 55%, 0.55, 5%, 0.05, 17%, 0.17, 98%, 0.98. Percent to decimal, you move the decimal point 2 to the left. From decimal to percent, however, you are going to move the decimal 2 to the right. 87%, 8%, 42%, 4%, 71%, and 7%. Make sure you also keep in mind the idea of having a decimal percent. For example, if I asked you to change 0.075, which is a decimal, into a percent, you would move your decimal point 2 to the right, and you would now have, the zeros are extra, 7.5%. Similarly, if I had something such as 43.21%, and I asked you to change it to a decimal, you would move it 2 to the left, and you would have 0.4321 with a 0 there. The assignment that I would like for you to work on tonight is a worksheet, F6.1, fractions, decimals, and percent. Make sure you download it and save it as well.